Hi everyone, my name is Katie Mercier. I'm the Coalition for Juvenile Justice's Communications Associate, and I'll be running the Civil Citations in Juvenile Justice webinar today. The first thing, I just wanted to run through a couple of technical details. First, all the participants are in listen-only mode. We will do questions at the end of the presentation. So at the end, if you have a question, you can hit the Raise Your Hand feature, or throughout the presentation, you can use the questions box and just type in your question. I will say that if you're on a cell phone or just not sure how your audio is going to sound, we highly recommend that you type in your question so that we can avoid any audio feedback issues. And so I would like to take a moment to introduce our speakers today. Mark Greenwald is the Director of Research for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice and is a doctoral student in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State University. His research interests include juvenile justice, delinquency, and crime in schools. His research has appeared in such journals as Criminology, Criminology and Public Policy, Criminal Justice and Behavior, the Journal of Criminal Justice, Youth Violence and Juvenile Justice, and Social Work with Groups. Theda Roberts is the Civil Citation Coordinator for the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, where she works to encourage and assist communities statewide to implement or improve civil citation. Prior to this position, Ms. Roberts analyzed juvenile justice issues in the Governor's Office of Policy and Budget in Florida. Ms. Roberts also spent 8 years working in state and local government for the Florida House of Representatives and Brevard County. She studied at Brevard Community College and the University of Central Florida. And with that, I'm actually going to launch our first poll and turn the presentation over to our presenters.
This is Theda. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're very excited to be part of this presentation. And just a little bit of background. In 2011, Florida embarked on a journey to start looking at ways to serve kids better. Civil citation was one of our initial ways to move in that direction. So it's been quite an interesting journey. And back in 2011, we pretty much had the perfect storm. We had a new governor who wanted to reform the way we do juvenile justice. He brought on a secretary who had reformed juvenile justice down in the Miami-Dade area. We had a House and a Senate that voted unanimously for the civil citation rewrite, not really a rewrite, an amending the civil citation statute. And we started on this journey that we're going to tell you about today. So there's our poll going on. Perfect.
It looks like
a good mix. You know, a good third of you have a moderate knowledge of civil citation, some low, some high. So that helps us as we go through this discussion. So back in 2011, prior to the amendment to the civil citation statute, civil citation was an option for communities. And at that time, we strengthened it so that that civil citation is required in each community as an option for law enforcement. They can arrest, they can cite a youth. It is a means to require accountability for the youth and consequences for the action. It is a non-criminal avenue to address common youth misbehavior. These are misbehaviors that most of us did and didn't get caught for. Civil citation is a community-driven program, so the stakeholders at the local level determine what it looks like. It's also a data-driven decision, as you're going to see as we go through the data in these slides. Ideally, it should work within existing programs. Our goal is not to go out and establish a new program where a diversion program already exists that can simply serve a population of youth in a little different way. And the bottom line is that civil citation increases public safety, improves youth outcomes, and saves taxpayer dollars. And we'll be talking about that as we progress through these slides. Next slide, please.
And this is Mark Greenwald. And so, why do we do civil citation? You know, what's different about this than diversion? What makes this special? And one of the big reasons why we do this is that most of the kids that come into our system, and I'm sure that's the way of most systems, don't come back. They've done something once, they've done something stupid, and they don't need much of a system response to keep them from recidivating. And so, you know, on the screen you're seeing some data from a study Don Andrews and and Bonta conducted, that they looked at a 5-year study and found that most first-time misdemeanors, about 2/3 of them, didn't come back into the system in an 18-month follow-up period. And that's the exact same pattern we found in Florida's data. Florida is a statewide centralized system, and we found the same thing, that 2/3 of the kids that come to us once don't come back. But the problem is that these kids all have a criminal record when they leave us, if they're formally arrested and formally processed through the system and receive diversion. And so one of the things that we want to avoid, if possible, is keeping kids out of the system that otherwise don't need to be in it, while at the same time keeping them from getting an arrest record that can have a lot of impacts that we'll talk about a little later in the presentation. But to give you a quick foreshadowing of that, it can affect whether or not you get into certain schools, it can affect housing, scholarships, etc. Next slide, please. And so one of the other things that we want to do with civil citation is, we know that 2/3 of the kids that come to us once don't come back, but we want to use effective screening to determine who those kids are that might come back to us again. One of the things that's been found nationally, as well as in Florida, is that most of our kids that become what I call frequent flyers, those kids that come to us repeatedly, most of those kids that become serious, violent, and chronic started young. They start very, very young. And in Florida, over 50% of the kids who ultimately become serious, that's a kid who has a felony offense, violent, that's a violent felony offense, and chronic, that's 4 separate and distinct arrest events. They started with us at the age of 12 or under. So they came to us young. And they are also the most likely to be the kids that go deeper into the system. They cost more money, they cost more time, resources, and treasure to deal with. And once they get to that point, our system, and really every system, is not as effective at dealing with those kids. So the idea with civil citation is that we're taking kids out of the pipeline. We're taking them out of circulation so that we can address their issues early before they become serious, violent, and chronic. Next slide. And so one of the other things that we're interested in doing is equal justice. By the time kids are arrested and processed through the delinquency system, we're not going to cure bias on the street or racism. But one of the things that we want to do is we want to make sure that kids are treated equitably. And we don't have to go into a lot of detail here, but for those of us that study these things, we know that African Americans are more likely to be arrested. They're more likely to commit the types of offenses that are going to be followed up by police. They're more likely to be followed up by prosecutors, all of which pushes them deeper into the system. And Florida is no different than any other jurisdiction. We have overrepresentation throughout the juvenile justice system. For example, African American youth are approximately 21% of the 10 to 17-year-old population in Florida. Those are the 10 to 17 years old is the vast majority of our customers, so that's the population range that we look at. But they're 38% or more of the kids that are arrested at intake. They're more than half the kids that go to secure detention. They're more than half the kids that go to secure residential commitment facilities, which is the deepest end of the juvenile justice continuum in Florida. And they're almost 2/3 of the youth that are transferred to adult court. And so the deeper you go into the system, the worse off it is for these kids. So one of the things that we want to do is ensure that minority youth, and in Florida we're essentially talking about African American youth, because Hispanic youth are chronically underrepresented in Florida, but we want to make sure that they're treated equitably so that they receive the exact same treatment that a similarly situated white youth or Hispanic youth would receive in Florida. Next slide. And so one of the other things that we look at is how many kids are coming to us in schools. We know Florida has one of the only reports that we know of that analyzes the number of kids that are arrested in Florida schools, the state schools, and that we look at every school in Florida. And when we started looking at this back in 2004 and in 2005, there was 28,008 juvenile arrests for an offense that occurred on school grounds. And why is this important? This is important because a lot of things can key off of this. When you're arrested in school, it can increase labeling pressures for the criminologists in the room. And it can increase likelihood of dropping out. It can increase how educational systems respond to youth. And one of the things that we found looking at this data in Florida was that for all the offenses that were committed, 57% of those were first-time offenders, and over 2/3 of those offenses were misdemeanor offenses. They were minor offenses. They were things like disorderly conduct, which is a very, very broad charge category, which most often entails the disruption of a school function. And what we saw was happening was that these kids were not getting the kind of interventions or messages that they needed, because 65% of these cases ultimately ended up being dismissed, not filed, or were diverted in some way. And so one of the strategies that we wanted to look to help abate this issue was civil citation. And we're going to go into some of the details a little later in the presentation, but we've seen a dramatic decline in both delinquency statewide, but also in schools. And if you remember, I mentioned that it was 28,008 back in 2004, 2005. During the last school year, that number had declined to 12,018. So it's dropped to less than half of what that number was before. Next slide, please. And so the other item is that we want to focus on the risk principle. And the risk principle means that we want to match services to the kids. We want to match the right service to the right kid at the right time and in the right dosage. Like I said earlier, 2/3 of the kids that come to us once aren't coming back. The vast majority of those kids don't need a lot. However, one of the things that we want to make sure is that we're providing appropriate screenings so we can identify any criminogenic needs or risks that these youth have so that we can address them early. One of the reasons why I changed the oil in my car is so that I don't have to replace my engine in a few years. It's much cheaper to do prevention and maintenance than it is to just do the big bills down the road. It's the same principle in juvenile justice with the risk principle. And one of the things that we found is that in this research is that if you provide low-intensity services to low-risk youth, you get better outcomes than if you provide high-intensity services to low-risk youth. Just like you wouldn't want to provide low-intensity services to high-risk youth. And so what civil citation does is it provides low-intensity, appropriately matched services to youth that doesn't put them unnecessarily deep into the juvenile justice system, which in and of itself can cause greater exposure to the delinquency system down the road. And then I think we have a poll after this slide.
We want to get a good idea of how civil citation is operating in the other states and jurisdictions within the state. So we appreciate you working with us on those polls. As we talked about earlier, prior to 2011, civil citation was not quite as organized. It had been on the books in Florida since the early 1900s. It was an option for law enforcement, state attorneys to get together and determine how to serve this, to do civil citation. It was sporadically enforced around the state. I think we had 17, 18 counties that were operating civil citation back in 2011. So we have, oh, that's interesting. We have about 1/3 of the states that are on this call that are operating civil citation. So that's interesting. So let's go ahead and launch that next one. So then we also had, we weren't collecting data for each of those counties. They were not required to submit data to DJJ. If we were offering them some grant funding to operate civil citation, then we would collect the data. So we didn't have a really good picture of what was going on within the state. It worked very, very well in some communities. In some communities it worked for a while and didn't, and then was back up. And so it was very spotty at that time. So in 2011, when we started looking at that statute, we did several significant things. And looks like we're almost ready to look at that next slide. So, okay, about the same. Okay, thank you. So let's have that next slide, please. Perfect. So in 2011, what we did was change the law so that every community would have a civil citation opportunity or a similar diversion program opportunity in each community. The law maintains law enforcement officers' discretion when they come in contact with the youth, whether to arrest or to cite. And it identifies the stakeholders who determine what civil citation look like in each community. That would be your chief circuit judge, your state attorney, your public defender, and the head of each law enforcement agency that's involved. And they determine what offenses would be considered eligible. They can determine who operates civil citation in that community and make those kind of internal decisions on what it looks like. And as a result, civil citation looks different in each one of our 67 counties. All abide by the statute, meet the requirements of the statute, but within their own structure, they look different from county to county. We also did some very significant things. We require that an assessment be done on every youth. And as Mark indicated, that's very key. We need to identify what's going on in that youth's life at the very earliest stage of delinquency and build protective factors around that youth. Those intervention services are required by statute to the youth and to the family if that's needed. And every youth who gets a civil citation must complete community service hours, up to 50 by the statute. The next slide, please. And starting that year in 2011, eligibility was limited to first-time, non-serious misdemeanors. Prior to that time, youth may have gotten a second bite of the apple, but it was very important in 2011 that, to the state stakeholders that we limit that. So we did. The youth must admit guilt, as they have to going through many diversion programs here in our state, and they can refuse to participate and go through the normal system. That statute change in 2011 specified that civil citation is not a referral, which is, as an arrest in the adult world. In the juvenile world, that would be an arrest. So it's not a referral to DJJ. And it ensures, though, that if that youth does not complete the sanctions, intervention services that are assigned to that youth, that original arrest charge goes through. So it's a win-win situation. You're giving the youth the opportunity to come through this without an arrest record. If the youth chooses not to comply, you have the assurance that that original charge goes forward. And it requires that civil citation data be reported to DJJ, and that's very important. We are a data-driven agency. This is a data-driven program, and so we want to see how it's doing. And then finally, it tasks DJJ to encourage and assist to implement, approve programs that are existing. And that's what I do, travel the state and talk about civil citation and looking at programming. Next slide, please. So when we started on this journey, we took some actions to get buy-in. Civil citation is a mind shift. You're taking a youth who has committed a criminal act and allowing that youth to have a civil citation. So there was a lot of buy-in that we needed to obtain. So we started including civil citation on training. We started getting around to the communities and talking about civil citation, educating those stakeholders who determine what civil citation looks like, what it is, and how it can help their community. We go in and train law enforcement agencies as they come on board with civil citation, or go back and give them refresher courses on a yearly basis. Depending upon the agency, we certainly make that available. We started including the adolescent brain development as part of that training, so that everyone understands that a teenage brain does not react anywhere near to an adult brain, and we should expect them to, and we should have strategies in place to help them get through the time when their brains aren't quite functioning as they will when they're older. And then we incorporated civil citation into presentations and trainings presented by the various program areas within the agency, so that we have a comprehensive approach. We also developed an assessment tool that is pulled from our validated assessment tool that we use for other youth that have been arrested in our agency. So, and we made that available to civil citation and to at-risk youth, and we provide that training and the use of that around the state to whoever wants to use it. And of course, there's no charge for that. And then we worked hard to get in front of different agents, different organizations. We spoke with the chiefs. We spoke in front of the sheriffs, School resource officers, there's a list there. And we have been invited to other states as well to talk about civil citation. And the most important thing is getting in front of the stakeholders and talking to them and talking with the juvenile justice boards and councils and those community meetings as well. And so the next slide is, next slide please, Katie, is our civil citation. I got that one, didn't I? I did. The next one, our next slide is, hold on just one second. I want to make sure I haven't skipped anything. Can we back up one slide, Katie? I think I missed one. There we go. Thank you. We, at the very initial stage of civil citation, that same year in 2011, the decision was made legislatively to limit the use of residential to certain youth arrest. So that generated a cost savings, and as part of that cost savings, we funneled that back into civil citation youth who needed mental health or substance abuse services. So that was one of the main ways we did to make sure that we had everything in place to serve this population, and of course my position as well. We also collaborated with the Eckert Family Foundation, who was also very interested in civil citation and wanted to make an impact around the state. And we worked with 3 counties to expand whatever program was in place. Mostly civil citations started in the schools. We worked hard to expand that to the community so that every youth in the county has the same opportunity for civil citation. It was very important to enhance collaboration of those community stakeholders so that everybody understands what civil citation is and is on the same page moving forward. We found when that happens, we have much higher buy-in, and we also have higher utilization of civil citation in the community. And then to engage countywide law enforcement. Those were our 3 goals moving forward with Eckert Foundation. Okay, so I've already talked about training, which would be the next slide. Thank you. And presentations I've already talked about, which would be the next slide. Thank you, Katie. And so the next slide.
Did you want 11 or 12? Sorry.
13.
Oh.
I got ahead of myself and missed a slide, so I had to back up. But now we're on track. And one of the things we did with all that data that came to the department was start looking at it very closely. And this is Mark's expertise. So take it, Mark.
So yeah, like Theda said, we're a very data-driven agency, which is good for me because I'm a researcher. But we devote a lot of time, effort, and resources into measuring different initiatives that we have going on, and civil citation is no different. What you're seeing on your screen right now is a screenshot from one of our interactive dashboards. We have a lot of different dashboards out there. This one deals specifically with civil citation. And these dashboards are interactive. They're on our website, the State of Florida Department of Juvenile Justice website. There's a tab called Research that you can click, and it takes you to all these different reports. And this shows you the number of civil citations that are coming into the agency each month, the number of arrests that are coming in, what number received a civil citation, and what number we deemed were eligible for a civil citation for a first-time offender, but actually came through the department as a formal arrest. And I'm a big believer in what gets measured gets done. And so what we do is we put a lot of information out on the web so that folks can search by county, by gender, by race, by the type of case, by the type of offense, to look exactly at where these cases are going in the system. In some jurisdictions, for example, as implementation moved along, you might have the sheriff, for example, was aggressively using civil citation for cases where it was available, but the local police departments needed a little bit more work. And so these dashboards and this information help our staff work with the local communities to show them who's getting civil citations and who's not. And on the non-public side of this dashboard, we actually have the ability to go down to the badge number and the officer to show, here's cases that came through formally, and here's cases that got civil citation. Let's have a conversation about maybe having a few more of these cases get civil citation. We don't expect that 100% of cases are going to get civil citation. Even in our flagship jurisdictions that very heavily rely on civil citations, the maximum number of cases that we see there is around 85%. There's always going to be a group of kids that don't qualify. When we talk about civil citations, we generally recommend it for all first-time misdemeanor offenders, but we think kids that present with gang-related issues, with weapons issues, or for sexual activity might require a higher look than what you would get initially with the civil citation. They still might qualify for it. We just think somebody like the state's attorney or somebody else should be looking at that and making that decision. And so this is just a screenshot and example of one of the reports that we have that's out there. And having the data and having the information is a powerful way of showing the stakeholders in your communities how the process is working. And we can move on to the next slide.
I love the dashboard, and I particularly love that it reflects that in May of this year, we served 43% of every eligible youth in the state of Florida. That was a high point for us. So when we started in 2011, we had a handful, 17 or 18 counties that were still had an existing civil citation program up and operating. Since that time, we've worked hard throughout the state to build consensus and buy-in, and we now have 58 of our 67 counties that are serving civil citation youth. We have various utilization within counties. Some counties have a very high utilization, others may not. Some may have one or two law enforcement agencies that are utilizing and others that are not. We do have 3 counties that have very high utilization because they have determined that every eligible youth gets civil citation. So we have Miami-Dade, who for several years has mandated that youth who are eligible get civil citation. And then we have as well Broward County, where they are just building utilization. Their program is a little newer, and they as well have the same policy. And then you have Pinellas County over on the other side of our state, where all the eligible youth are examined at one point in the sheriff's office, and they determine whether that youth gets civil citation or not. And they have very, very high utilization there as well. Those are the only 3 counties. We have high utilization in other counties as well, though. So that's where we are right now as a state. We're working on those 4 counties that are in green. We expect to see them pretty close. And then still working on buy-in on the rest of those counties. Next, please.
And so this slide shows the number of cases that are coming to us as a first-time arrest and the number of civil citations that has been issued, going back to 2011, 2012. And so on the left, that's your civil citations, and on the right are the number of first-time arrests. One of the questions that we get and what we constantly want to monitor is whether or not we're net widening. What we don't want to do is we don't want to catch kids in the net who would otherwise not get some type of court involvement or diversion involvement. Officers use discretion every single day, and the number of persons they arrest is generally a lot smaller than the number of persons they come into contact with. And we don't want to have a process that kids go through a civil citation process if they weren't going to go through that in the first place. And so what this chart essentially is showing you is that as time moves on, both the number of first-time misdemeanor arrests has declined and the number of civil citations has increased slightly, but in total, in aggregate, the total number of kids that qualify for that service has continued to decline from 26,763 a couple of years ago to 21,349 last year. And there's a couple of reasons why the numbers look like this. For those of you that study these things, delinquency is down nationally. Delinquency arrests have been down quite a bit for several years. And if you take data from OGJDP and looks nationwide, between 2005 and 2010, delinquency declined, or delinquency arrests declined roughly 17% between those 5 years. And when you look at Florida, during that same time period, delinquency arrests declined 28%. And we think a lot of that has to do with civil citation. And so at first we were a little concerned that we weren't seeing more civil citations being issued, that they were actually relatively flat. And that's really because there's fewer kids to work with. fewer kids are being arrested, fewer kids are coming into contact with the police, and so there's not as many opportunities for them to use civil citation. The key is the ratio, the percentage of eligible cases that are being issued a civil citation versus a formal arrest. Next slide, please.
So when we talk about civil citation benefits to law enforcement, there are several things I like to point out when I'm talking to law enforcement. It typically requires less officer time, would certainly require no court appearance. It does decrease the operational cost because of that, because they're not touching that kid as often, and frees up those resources for more serious crimes, helps them be on the street a little bit more. The primary assurance and benefit for law enforcement is they know when they write a civil citation that that youth is going to be held accountable, and that if that youth does not complete, then that youth goes back through the system on the original arrest, just like civil citation had never happened. And the final thing that is a benefit to law enforcement is that it increases public safety. Civil citation increases public safety. Next slide, please.
And so when we talk about public safety, we're usually looking at recidivism. And so this chart just shows the latest recidivism data we have available in Florida. In Florida, we define recidivism as an adjudication withheld, or an adult conviction for an offense committed within 12 months of completing a program or service. And so this chart shows you the variety of services the department has, everything from civil citation to prevention programs, things like Boys and Girls Clubs, diversion programs, probation supervision, then residential, which is the deepest end of our system. And civil citations recidivism rate was 4%. It was, far and away the lowest recidivism rate of any of the intervention services that we offer. But that really shouldn't shock us, because if you remember what I opened the presentation up with, most of these kids are coming to us once and aren't coming back. And so it's good, and it shouldn't shock us that we have a very, very low recidivism rate for civil citation. What we're doing is we're giving kids a swift and immediate sanction, which the literature would suggest is the best way of dealing with these kids, while at the same time not giving them the arrest record, the other baggage that's going to prevent them from being successful going forward. Next slide.
There are also advantages to the community at large. It addresses the behavioral needs of youth and families at that very earliest stage of delinquency. That statute does allow us to address the family's concerns as well, so we can refer that family to counseling if they need it. It reduces the cost of processing youth for misdemeanors in the various systems that a youth would touch. Certainly that would be at the initial arrest, it would be the state attorney, the law enforcement, and the juvenile justice. If that youth progressed further into our system, the cost savings would also occur at the court system and at the public defender's office as well. So it reduces the cost of processing youth in all those systems, and it builds that equal justice that we talked about when every youth in the county has the same opportunity for civil citation. And we are beginning to see that with this data Mark is going to talk about in the next slide.
And so if you remember earlier in the presentation, we talked about minority representation. Us wanting to see equity in the system. And one of the things that we're very excited about with civil citation is that's exactly what we see. We see that minority youth, specifically Black and Hispanic youth, have the same opportunity to receive a civil citation as the white youth in our system. If you recall, I said that roughly 38% of the kids that come through the department's front door that are arrested and processed by the department are African American. And you see a similar percentage of youth now, as of last fiscal year, qualifying and receiving civil citation. And so that's something that we're constantly monitoring, but we're very excited about that because, again, if these youth get the same opportunities as the white youth, and we get the same kind of performance outcomes for these youth that the white youth have in this program, we can expect to help push these kids out of the system before they get deeper into the system. Next slide.
So not only are youth getting equal justice and we're making a dent in that disproportionate minority contact, but civil citation benefits youth in other ways as well. It intervenes early in delinquency. We've talked about that those youthful offenders that come to us 12 or younger are the ones that are more likely to escalate through our system. It addresses the concerns of youth when they first come into contact with our system. and it holds them accountable with immediate sanctions. That is key, and one of the successes of civil citation. You are getting that kid in front of the civil citation operating entity, the program that operates civil citation, very quickly. The youth has 7 working days by law to get in contact with the system and start that ball rolling, and compared to several months if the arrest had gone through. It does help avoid escalation into the juvenile justice system. One of the cases that came to the governor's office early on was a young girl who came in on a relatively minor charge, but because she had abuse in her background, she acted out, racked up more charges, and she was with us for 3 years when she came into our attention in the governor's office. And civil citation is a way to stop that. It is addressing whatever's going on at that earliest stage of delinquency, getting it out of the way, and helping avoid that escalation into our system. And doing that by identifying those youth who are most likely to come back. But the biggest advantage to youth is, well, one of the biggest advantages is they have no criminal history record to move forward. Oh, thank you. And so next slide, please. So what happens when when a youth gets an arrest? The public defender down in Miami-Dade put this list together. And I think it's very interesting. It's a lot of the things we've talked about. A criminal history record is created at the state and the federal level, and that negative labeling on that child is obviously very critical. We can see that a youth who gets civil citation has a 4% chance of getting in trouble again. A youth who is arrested and go into a very similar diversion program has a 13% chance. So we can see that negative labeling working right there. Rearrest is more likely once a youth is arrested. The youth may be suspended once the school is notified. It certainly contributes to dropping out of school. It impedes military service, educational opportunities, vocational opportunities. Youth may not even be eligible for financial assistance for that secondary education, and those other. There are several that are very important. Losing public housing assistance, driver license suspension are 2 of those as well. So let's look at the process in the next slide. Very quickly, the officer comes in contact with that first-time misdemeanor, decides to go with the civil citation for that youth. The arrest forms are held at that beginning by the operating entity, and they just stay right there until we see what's going to happen with that youth. The operating entity in Florida, about 20 of our counties, the team court manages civil citation. It could be a neighborhood accountability board. We have law enforcement agencies that manage civil citation. And in our small rural communities that don't have a lot of resources, DJJ, our probation officers will manage that civil citation. Our secretaries have been very dedicated to making sure civil citation takes place, and we'll provide our resources if that's what it takes to make it happen. So that operating entity does that assessment, determines whatever interventions are necessary, be it anger management, could be family counseling, substance abuse, mental health services. In cases of domestic violence, it'd be family counseling as well, and sets the sanctions that youth will get. And if, of course, the youth is successful, no juvenile record moving forward. If unsuccessful, that original arrest paperwork is taken out and provided to the state attorney, and the arrest goes forward as it would have in the beginning. Thank you, and next slide. Mark talked a little bit about eligibility. We have a model plan that by statute we put together, and we define eligibility as any first-time misdemeanor except those that are sexual in nature, that are firearm related, or gang related. And so when you look at our dashboard, we have pulled out all those sexual offenses and firearm offenses as well. We don't necessarily know if the offense is gang related, so that is not addressed. We don't, of course, can't pull out that data. And then those bottom 4 offenses, battery, assault, non-firearm weapon possession, and animal cruelty, those may be eligible once the state attorney, the victim, the family all get together and determine that that's the best thing that in the interest of that child to occur. In most counties, have adopted these standards. We do have some counties who have lesser eligibility for their use. Next slide, please.
And that's what I'm going to talk about. And so one of the things we found with implementation in Florida is some counties use it across a broad spectrum of misdemeanor offenses, while other counties have started with a smaller group of offenses. Most commonly, they'll start with things like disorderly conducts and petty thefts. And so one of the things my office did is we took a look at first-time misdemeanor offenders, kids that received civil citation, and kids that were formally processed and ended up going to diversion. And we wanted to compare their outcomes. One of the things we heard is, well, we think we can use this for kids that steal a candy bar, but a kid that gets caught with a joint, that's indicative of higher level offending, and that kid really needs to be formally processed to get what they need. And we really didn't find any evidence of that. What this table is showing you is a comparison by offense category of youth that completed civil citation compared to their matched pair that completed diversion. What we did is we took kids that completed civil citation programs, and we found their clone, their pair, using propensity score matching that completed a diversion program. And then we compared the recidivism outcomes, and that's the closest we can get to random assignment, but it shows you that child A is similar to child B in Group 1 versus Group 2. And what we found was that civil citation was either more effective or as effective as diversion across every single offense category that we looked at. Keep in mind some of these categories, the number of cases was relatively small. But the main takeaway was it was just as effective for kids that had minor drug offenses, for kids that were trespassing, for kids that were committing a petty theft or had alcohol or had disorderly conduct offenses. They did just as well or better on civil citation as kids that received some type of formal processing and a diversion placement. And remember, the kids that go through civil citation in many jurisdictions are getting the exact same placement intervention as the kids that are being diverted. The difference is they're not having that formal arrest and that label applied to them. Next slide.
Our process here in Florida is for law enforcement, they can transport that youth to an assessment center, and the assessment center takes it from there and does all the work. They can issue a school or a field citation by confirming eligibility and identity, releasing the youth to the responsible parent, adult, or to the parent, and providing the civil citation information to that operating entity. And next slide, please. And then that operational, next slide, please. And then the operating entity takes the youth and does all the work, gets in contact with the youth, makes sure that the youth and parents sit down, understand the program, signs the forms, does the needs assessment, and then closes out the case. We've talked about most of this as we've gone along, so let's go on to the next slide. So the takeaway for this presentation is that civil citation increases public safety, and it does that because fewer arrests increase safety in the community. Not only are you having fewer arrests on the youth now, but you are having fewer arrests as well. And it improves youth outcomes. Fewer youth are arrested when whatever's going on in their life is addressed at that very front end. And that's our goal as an agency, to address problems at the front end so that we don't see them at the back end. And the final thing civil citation does is save taxpayer money. It's been estimated, this is dated research, but it's the most recent that we have right now, that it costs about $386 for a youth to get a civil citation, compared to about $5,000 if that youth were arrested. So it is a significant cost saving. I'll let Mark talk about some work that we're doing to finalize that.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're doing right now is we're partnering with an outside research group to really look at the costs associated with civil citation, both in terms of physical money costs and cost avoidance. One of the things, I'm a criminologist and I'm not an economist, and so we're working with some economists to bring some of those costs in, because one of the main benefits of the civil citation process is it puts law enforcement officers back in service faster. They don't want to have to carry kids around in the back of their car trying to find someone to release them to, or take them to an assessment center, fill out a lot of paperwork. It puts cops back on the street faster. And so trying to put a cost on the process is something that we're working with folks so that folks can understand both the physical cost savings of the court with fewer cases and whatnot, as well as the benefits to both the Juvenile Justice Department in processing fewer cases and law enforcement processing fewer cases and being back on the street faster and for longer periods of time. And so with that, I think we've given you everything we've meant to give you, and we're going to move on to questions and answer.
On that next slide, just so you know, there's some information if you want to reach me. There's our civil citation web page with a lot of information as well as our model plan, and then that final link is to our dashboard.
Great, thanks Theda and Mark. So we'll do questions. Just as a reminder, you can type your questions into the questions box, or you can click the raise your hand feature and I can unmute you. While we're letting questions come in, I just wanted to remind everyone that the PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar will be available on CJJ's website. That's juvejustice.org. And with that, our first question is, does the county or state pay for the services to which youth are referred, and has this been a problem?
It has not been a problem. Civil citation is not creating a new program. It's simply using the existing resources in a slightly different way. We have made some grant funding available to counties with a need. That's very minimal funding, primarily to counties that have very low resources. But ideally, civil citations should not cost a county any more money.
Okay, our next question is, when law enforcement officers have the discretion to utilize civil citations in the field, how do you ensure that discretion isn't abused or misused?
Well, that's really not our call to make. The approach that we have taken is when we are in front of law enforcement agencies to do much the same presentation that we have here, so they understand why civil citation is important and start gaining that buy-in. And that's what's been effective in making the difference in getting almost half of the youth in May who are eligible getting a civil citation.
And this is Mark, and one of the things that we do for the research office is we examine the number of cases that are coming in and the number of civil citations issued. You know, one of the things we wouldn't want to see is that if we're on a downward trajectory of fewer first-time misdemeanors, fewer first-time offenders coming into the system, we wouldn't want to see then a dramatic spike when you add in the number of kids that are getting civil citation, which goes to one of the slides we had around the middle of the presentation that looks at the combination of both civil citation and first-time offenders. And so one of the ways we can monitor it is with data to make sure that we're not net weighting. We're not seeing an overall increase in the number of kids touching the system, even though civil citation does its best to keep kids out of the system.
Okay, our next question is, do you have any information about the use of civil citations with status offenses, such as truancy, runaways, and incorrigibility?
In Florida, I don't believe those are crimes, and so I don't believe you can be arrested for those. So I'm not sure how much they would be used for that. We have another series and network of services that are available for youth that have those issues. You know, truancy, maybe not necessarily in and of itself for truancy, but maybe if it's, you know, come over with other issues, they might get the school involved in a process similar to civil citation, but because those aren't technically a crime, as far as I'm aware, they wouldn't really be eligible.
We want to keep civil citation. A youth gets one opportunity for civil citation, that's it. So we don't want them to get civil citation for a non-criminal offense, and that's exactly what Mark has just said.
Okay, our next question is, why have 5 counties not implemented the civil citation?
Well, we keep asking ourselves that. We have some counties that are very comfortable with the diversion process in place and are not interested in moving in a different direction. We have made significant progress just within the last year in knocking down those counties that are not participating, and we're hoping, you know, that we come to a collaborative agreement with the rest of the counties.
Our next question is, what is the difference between civil citation and juvenile diversion?
It's pretty much the arrest.
It's essentially the arrest record. Many kids are going to get the same type of an assessment. They might get the same type of services. You know, for example, if you come into us for let's say you come into us for possession of alcohol under the age of 21, okay, which would be a status offense. You know, that kid might need substance abuse treatment. You can get that substance abuse treatment via civil citation. You don't have to be arrested to have it, though. When we did community meetings around the state years ago, one of the messages we heard loud and clear was that I shouldn't have to get my kid arrested to get them services. And so it really is just similar services, similar screening, similar process. The only difference is they're not generating the arrest record to make that all happen.
And the major difference is that the kids who get civil citation on the same offenses have much less recidivism.
Okay, our next question is, who is responsible to assure that the conditions of the civil citation are met?
That would be the local operating entity, be it teen court, neighborhood accountability board, DJJ, law enforcement. Whoever is operating civil citation at that local level is responsible for making sure the youth meets those requirements.
And one of the nice things about it is that law enforcement in the communities where we have this in place knows that someone else is following up on the kid. You know, most law enforcement that I've met just want to know that the kid's being held accountable and they're getting the services that they need. And they know that someone is following up on that youth. And in most areas, it's not the law enforcement officer. It's somebody else doing that job for them.
Okay, our next question is, what is the process or criteria for taking a civil citation and moving it to an arrest for noncompliance?
Sure, yeah. What happens is, in Florida, we have a centralized information system. It's called JJS. That all juvenile arrests, placements, supervision statuses, the whole kitchen sink is in that information system. That's the delinquency side of the house. We also have a separate and distinct prevention web system, which is where we track youth that go through prevention programs and alternative to arrest programs. That's called Prevention Web. And when a youth comes in and is registered for civil citation, they will go into our prevention web system, which has very, very limited access. Generally, only our staff conducting intake screenings have access to those records, or individuals running prevention programs, and even they only have access to the kids in their programs. If a youth fails to complete their services, fails to complete their community service, whatever it is, it's actually very simple. The record that we started in the prevention web system is then automatically moved over to the delinquency system, and it is filed just like a normal arrest.
Our next question is, what barriers did you encounter when the civil citation was first presented?
There were several barriers. I think the primary one we encountered first was from existing diversion programs that were just a little cautious about what we were doing, whether it was going to impact their turf and maybe even their funding. So that was one of the barriers. And the second primary barrier is simply been overcoming that mindset that civil citation is only a slap on the wrist, and you know, getting the point across that there are substantive measures that have to be met, and if not, that original arrest paperwork goes through.
Our next question is, what percentage of kids that receive civil citations successfully complete the program?
That information is available on our website. I believe it's in the neighborhood of 80+%. I don't have the number memorized, but it's over 80% actually complete the program.
Successfully.
Successfully. And the difference between that and 100% is usually due to one of a couple of factors. Either A, you know, obviously they decide they're not going to complete the sanctions and we have to process it as an arrest. The other most common type are juveniles. After they initially get the civil citation, they might decide that they want to go through with the formal process rather than the civil citation. They may choose they want to fight the charge on the sanction, which they're certainly entitled to. And a third, less common, is we might find that the youth was not actually eligible for civil citation. If you remember what I said a moment ago, the juveniles that go through prevention programs and pre-arrest diversion programs go in our prevention web, which has very, very restrictive access. Although you know, we make it available to the people that need to know, so that they know on the street and that they know at our intake screening centers that the kid is or is not eligible. But occasionally someone gets through that participated in a program before and wasn't in there, and we find out that they're not eligible, and we have to pull them out and process them formally. But that's more rare.
Our next question is, are officers required to make any kind of contact with a youth's parent or guardian after issuing a civil citation?
It's not a requirement by law, But as far as I know, because my legal expertise is limited to 985-12, the Civil Citation Statute, but it is practice at the law enforcement agencies that they release the child to the adult, to the parent or responsible adult, and get the parents' buy-in to civil citation as well. And if if the parents cannot be located at that time, there is an additional opportunity once the youth gets in front of the screeners for the screeners to say, yes, this youth is eligible for civil citation, and perhaps reach out to the parent at that time.
Our next question is, when comparing recidivism rates between civil citations and diversion, how do you respond to the argument that civil citations should actually have a lower recidivism rate because the higher risk cases are not accepted?
I would say that when you look at those counties where they utilize civil citation for all of those eligible arrests, and you see recidivism rates of 3%, then that is an argument that civil citation works for all of those risk levels.
And that's a very good question. And what I would say to it from the research side is part of our process of comparing civil citations to diversions, we try to control for those kinds of things. You know, for example, if you have a kid that has a battery that involves gang activity and things like that, we're not going to match that kid up against a kid that did not have those things and went through civil citation. And so we try to very carefully control for that to the extent we can, because there are markers in our system that let us know weapons were involved, gang activity was involved, cruelty to animals, what have you was involved. We match these kids on dozens of different measures to make sure we're trying to get as close a match as possible to account for that. But that's a very good question.
All right, I wanted to just thank our presenters one more time for doing such a great webinar. Like I said, the PowerPoint and the recording will be up on our website within 24 hours, and you have their contact information up on the screen if you have any further questions. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone and have a great day.
Thank you.